A Place Called Home by Laurie Wick. Chapter 15. Luke Cameron shifted his weight on the train seat. Why did the last 50 miles to Baxter always feel like the longest? Deliberately taking a night train out of Chicago, it had given him one more day with Paul, and he figured he could sleep on board. But he had figured wrong. Luke had only dozed, and now he felt achy and irritable. He realized as he sat there that it would be hours before he could crawl between the sheets of his own bed. His own bed, the thought brought a smile to his lips. At his height, he really missed the length of the specially made bed. It had belonged to his parents, Joseph and Catherine Cameron, who had both been very tall. As usual, whenever Luke thought of his parents and the wonderful marriage they had, it brought a painful ache to his chest over his own single state. He and Mark were both 28 years old. God had seen fit to give Mark a wife. He had also been blessed with Emily, and now another baby was due very soon. Luke felt a bit envious, but he decided long ago that God's will was best. With his acceptance came the desire to live to the fullest, alone or not. This submission, nevertheless, did not deter Luke from praying for the desire of his heart. At one time he prayed simply for a wife, but the years passed and no feelings of love developed for any of the young women at church. This caused Luke's prayer to change, and he began to pray for preparation. Daily he prayed for growth and wisdom, asking God to help him be ready if ever God chose to give him a wife. Another thing Luke did over the years was to observe. The two marriages he was closest to were those of his brother and sister. After much time watching Mark and Suzanne, and Mac with Julia, Luke was sure that God would give him a wife like Suzanne. Sue was sweet, gentle, and submissive. Luke loved his sister Julia, but she certainly had a mind of her own. He wondered at times if Mac had any control over her at all. Luke remembered back to a time when Julia was 12 years old. She had put on a pair of boys' jeans, sneaked out of the house, and gone riding astride. She had gotten into trouble for it, but it had never stopped her. In fact, she was still doing it. Why, just a few days before Luke had left for Chicago, Julia had ridden over, in blue jeans, astride her horse. Luke had stared at her jean-clad legs in tight-lipped disapproval, causing the happy smile on Julia's face to vanish. That she had come over especially to have a quiet visit with him before he left for his trip only occurred to him after, without dismounting, Julia handed him a basket of his favorite cookies, and then with a quiet, "I'll miss you, Luke," pulled her horse around and rode away. Luke, awash with guilt, knew he had to see her and make things right. So after supper he rode over to the MacDonald farm, only to be told by Mac that Julia had gone to bed early with a headache. Mac stood watching his brother-in-law run long fingers through his dark curly hair in mild frustration. Mac was reasonably sure that Luke was the reason Julia had come home from her ride with red, swollen eyes. As strong-willed as Julia was, Luke's approval had always been important to her. Luke was also a bit too stern for his own good. Luke had not been able to see Julia to apologize until the night of her birthday party. Smiling, she told him it didn't matter, but Luke could see the hurt she was trying so hard to hide. Luke's hand went to the bag on the seat next to him. He hoped Julia would like the book and small glass dish he had found for her in Chicago. He planned on telling her again how sorry he was, and hopefully they could have the talk they were cheated out of because of his thoughtlessness. The dish he had bought for Julia brought his thoughts back to Chicago and Caroline. Caroline Chambers. Luke had been staying with Frank and Lily Chambers. Their massive ranch housed more than 200 head of horses. The same day Luke decided which horses he wanted, Caroline, the Chambers' 17-year-old daughter, returned from a visit to her cousins. Luke had liked her instantly. She was small and blonde, with a bubbly, talkative personality. The two had gone riding and for walks. When Luke was ready to go and stay with Paul, Caroline had talked him into returning for her 18th birthday party that weekend. Luke had had a wonderful time at the party, feeling more drawn to Caroline as the evening progressed. But the next morning, when Luke attended church with the Chambers family, he felt terribly let down. The church was large, but only about half the pews were filled. Luke listened as the minister read a single Bible verse, shut the book, and never once referred back to it. His monotone voice droned on and on about the sinful state of the city, but not once did he mention the fact that Jesus Christ died for those sins. Frank Chambers slept through the entire service. Each time Luke glanced at Caroline, she was looking at him, making him wonder how much of the sermon she had heard. Later, Caroline begged Luke to write. Luke had not committed himself and had only smiled at her, even when she grabbed his hand, pressing her address into his palm. Luke wondered a bit at the mixture of relief and regret he felt as he left. Luke's visit with Paul had been wonderful. Paul's natural speaking ability was popular on campus, and even though he was still in school, he had already been asked to fill the pulpit at several small churches. His enthusiasm was catching, making it even harder for Luke to leave. The men had embraced for long moments, knowing that it would probably be Christmas before Paul got home again. It was getting light out now, and Luke could see the countryside. He guessed the train to be within 20 miles of Baxter. "It's beautiful up in our neck of the woods," Luke had told Frank Chambers one evening. Frank decided, then and there, that he and the missus needed a little time away, and that they would deliver the horses together. They would be up in a few weeks. Luke was to wait for a wire. As the train pulled into Baxter, Luke stood and stretched his cramped muscles. He couldn't keep the smile from his face as his long legs carried him toward Grandma M's. It felt so good to be home.